Welcome to the Jacques Guibord house. This is an 1806 house, almost 203 years old, built by a Frenchman named Jacques-Jean-René de Guibord de Luzenay. And Jacques was a true Frenchman who had spent some time in Saint Domingue down in the Caribbean and had been smuggled out of that country in a barrel by his slave Moros during a slave uprising in 1791. Jacques and his slave went back to France and was involved at that time. The French Revolution was going on, and so he decided to come to America. And we first find him here in the United States in Philadelphia in 1798, and by 1799 he was here in SteGenTV. He first had a mercantile store just across the street from the house here where Valley High School is, and he sold all kinds of goods to people here in SteGenTV. Soon after he arrived here, he also became the owner of a lead mine, a tanyard, some farmland, another lot here in town, and fell in love with a girl named Ursula Barbeau. And she was the daughter of a merchant from Kaskaskia, or Prairie du Rocher, across the river. She was the youngest daughter of Mr. Barbeau, and fortunately her sister was the wife of Jean-Baptiste Vallée, the commandant here in SteGenTV. So it was pretty good that Jacques got all these Spanish land grants for these various properties. In 1806, he built this house. It was right after the Louisiana Purchase. It's built in the French style. You can see the tall ceilings, the exposed beams with the little beading on them, the sharp doors that were typical of the French houses. It's a fairly large house. It was a 3-room vertical log house. The room that we're standing in was used primarily to receive guests and would have been their social room where they would have had parties and dances. The Guibords lived in this house for over 100 years, and when Jacques' granddaughter Victorine Guibord died in 1906, the house was bought by the Clovis Boyer family, and they lived here until 1931. At that time, Jules Vallée, a great-great-nephew of Mrs. Guibord, bought the house and renovated it, put in lights and electricity in the various rooms, and also put in plumbing, kind of the amenities of life that we're used to. Jules and his wife Anne-Marie lived in the house and collected all this beautiful furniture that we have here. This is Louis XV, XVI furniture. And Jules died in 1949. Anne lived here until 1972, and when she passed, she gave this house to the Foundation for Restoration of SteGenTV, and we use it as a public tour house. In terms of ghost stories in this room, there's not really a lot. Just most of the ones that center around the dogs that Mr. and Mrs. Vallée owned, that seemed like when they would come into this room, they'd start barking all the time as if somebody was at the door, or they'd frolic like there was another dog in the room. They never could find anybody outside, but that was just one of the few stories from their time period about this room. And we'll go on into the dining area.
Hi, my name is Alicia. I also work for the foundation and give tours here at the Guibord house. The dining room area, which is this room, was where Jacques and Ursula would have all of their meals. All of their meals were prepared by their own servants and slaves who lived here on the property. Also, everything they ate was grown on the property as well. They had herb garden, vegetable gardens. They also had their own fruit orchard and a vineyard, and so they made their own wine. When Jacques and Ursula were not using this room as a dining room, this was also where Jacques would hold business meetings, because in addition to his mercantile shop, he also owned a lead mine and a tannery, as well as some farmland. And when he would conduct business, oftentimes what he would do is he would barter, because there was not a whole lot of cash coin. So when he would trade things from his mercantile shop, it would oftentimes be cloth or thread or teacups and saucers, things that people couldn't really make for themselves, but they could use to make other things for. And so when Jacques would trade those items, oftentimes he would be paid in lead or fur, or in one case someone else's debt, and also in sometimes money. At the time when there was cash coin, it was often Spanish, and so they would cut it into fourths called 2 bits, or in some cases even to 8, where we get the phrase pieces of 8. As for hauntings in this particular room, really it's the chandelier that gives the most indication. Oftentimes, if there is paranormal activity, the chandelier lights will flicker and fade or go out entirely, and it's never the same bulb. When we go to repair it, the next bulb will go out and it'll do the same thing.
This is the bedroom of the Guibord house, and originally it was a much larger room. When the Valleys bought the house in 1931, they added an extra room in here, or closed in a room to have their bathroom and steps down to the basement. This is the area of the house where in colonial times Mr. and Mrs. Guibord would have had their bed and slept here, and the children would have also slept in this same room. The Guibords had 5 children, but only 3 of them grew to adulthood. One, Eugene, stayed here in town, married one of the daughters of St. Gem, and had 13 children. But only 4 of those lived to adulthood, and none of them got married and extended the name. 2 of Jacques and Ursula's sons, Omer and Jules, went back to France when after their mother died, and ended up being married over there and raising families. And there's descendants of Jacques Guibord, not in the United States anymore, but now in France. But there's, in this room, there's been several stories that related to unusual happenings. One was after Mr. Valet died, Anne-Marie was sleeping here one night with the door closed, and all of a sudden she started hearing all these noises in the house of furniture being moved and glassware being broken, and she woke up and was very startled, but she went out in the hallway and supposedly yelled, "Stop it, stop it, get out of my house, you're not going to scare me away," and went back to bed. And the next morning she got up and there was nothing moved in the house and no glass broken. One of the earliest ghost stories we have of the Guibord house, and it's one that's been written about in books, it's called The Curious Visitors. And that's when Jules Valet, Anne-Marie's husband, was recuperating in 1939 from surgery on one of his eyes, and he was resting in bed, and all of a sudden he felt a very cool breeze come across the bedroom, and then he could smell honeysuckle, and all of a sudden he could see 3 individuals, only from the waist up, clad in old woven cloth shirts. And they didn't say anything to him, but he got this very peaceful feeling and knew that he was going to recover. And that's really the first ghost story that we have about the house, and that's Jules and the 3 curious visitors. We're in the attic of the Guibord house, and it's a marvelous structure up here, and it's really how you can tell that this is a French colonial style house. If you look over here, you can see the vertical logs coming from the sill and down in the basement, and how they're tied in with the top plate. And you can see these marvelous Norman trusses here. These were hewn out on the ground with an axe and a broad axe, and brought up here and assembled on site. You can trace this style of architecture from Normandy, France to Quebec to here to St. Genevieve. And it's still built in the French style even after the Americans were here. We here in St. Genevieve have served under 3 different flags: the flags of France, the flags of Spain, and then the flags of the United States. We really don't have a lot of ghost stories about the attic here. It was used primarily for storage. Sometimes people have reported hearing footsteps up here when there's nobody else in the house, and that's about the only thing that we've had associated with the attic. But it's what's really marvelous, though, I think, while they're not ghosts, it's the spirit of all the people that have lived in St. Genevieve in the French colonial times, and they have these marvelous structures that are still here after 200 years. They built them pretty darn well.
construction.
This brick structure behind me here was built or added on just a little bit, about 20 years after the original house was built. And it was a kitchen and also a servant or slave quarters. But we do have a few stories that are related to that. One of Mrs. Valley's early housekeepers was a lady named Dora Williams, and after she died, Mrs. Valley was downstairs one day and all of a sudden she heard footsteps upstairs. And she thought that it was Dora had come back. And she only heard it one time, but over the years we've had other docents tell us that they've heard steps above the kitchen area. And also for a while we had a Mrs. Bosler that was lived here in the house, and she had bought this old Victrola machine, and she was living upstairs over the kitchen, and she would go to put a record on it, and she'd crank it up and it'd start to turn, but when she tried to put the needle on it, it would speed up. And so she couldn't play her records. She always attributed that to some kind of unusual influence. This same Mrs. Bowser one time was in the basement of the house doing some work, and all of a sudden she heard a piano playing. It was like a child practicing a classical piece over and over again. And so she went upstairs, and there's obviously no piano in the house, and she couldn't figure out what was going on. So she went back downstairs, and all of a sudden she heard some man yell, "Hey!" And she went upstairs, and there's nobody in the house. She looked out in the street, looked in the garden, looked all over, nobody was there. And that was another strange experience that she had. So the Guibord house has got a lot of history that we know about, and we also have a lot of stories that go along with this very marvelous structure. In this area of the house was the part of the original property. Jacques and his wife owned this entire city block, which was kind of unusual for the time in St. Genevieve. Most people only owned a quarter of a block or a half of a block at the most. But in what they would have in back of the house would have been a detached kitchen, their well, and we still have the original well here.
Okay.
And they would have had an oven back here, barns, stables, corn cribs, a milk house if they had cows, slave cabins, and further back on the lot they would have had their vegetable gardens, their pleasure garden. The French loved to put flowers in with their vegetables, and they would have had an orchard and grapes growing back there. All of the French like to have their wine, and so they would make wine out of their grapes. They would also grow peaches, apples, pears. We have records that they made a lot of peach brandy back in those days too. So that's a little bit of this lot has changed over the years. It stayed with Mrs. Guibord until she died in 1843. Then the lot was split up between the three boys. The two bachelor boys got the house in the south half of the lot, and the married brother had the north half of the lot. After the two bachelor brothers went back to France and eventually married over there, in 1859, they sold the south half of the lot and the house to their brother Eugene for $50, and it stayed in his family till 1906.
Yeah, go ahead and end it that way. You got anything to end it with?
Let me think for a minute. Well, we'd like to have all the citizens of St. Genevieve come up and visit us at the Jacques Guibord house. It's an interesting house. It was an interesting family. The Jules Valley family was also very interesting, and some of the stories we have. And the stories of Moros, the slave, is a part of St. Genevieve history. So if you've never been here, come visit us. We'd be glad to talk to you and let you experience some of St. Genevieve's great. We'd like to welcome you to the 2009 Spirit Reunion, sponsored by the Foundation for Restoration of St. Genevieve. It's going to be a wonderful evening in St. Genevieve's Memorial Cemetery, Missouri's oldest, and tonight visitors are going to get to experience some of St. Genevieve's earliest pioneers and hear their stories and hear the stories of St. Genevieve.
Anything to add?
No, I don't. That's town somewhere. So, yeah, I'm starting down at the bottom. Oh, I know.
I was married to Vital Bouvet, one of the wealthiest men in Kaskaskia across the river. We moved here after the American push started because we didn't want to have to deal with the Americans. I married Vital when I was 23 years old, and in our marriage we had 13 children. Only 8 of my children, however, lived to be adults. My husband changed my life quite a bit when in 1793 he had a young man named Henry Marie Brackenridge come to live with us. Henry Marie was not French. Henry was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and his father wanted him to learn to speak French and the French customs, and it was closer to send him to us than to send him to France. Henry was only 7. He came here without his parents, without any family or relatives, and for 3 years he was virtually my child. But there was one problem with Henry. Henry was not a Catholic. He was a heathen, and I did not want him staying in the house with my children or sleeping in the same room until I had him baptized. Henry stayed until he was 9. When he came to us, he could only say yes and no in French, but when he left, he could only say yes and no in English. When I was an older woman, I had a slave that had an incident. She decided, her name was Pélagie, and she decided she was going to move in with a Frenchman named Benjamin Amaro, and they set up housekeeping. And they started having children. When her first son, Felix, was 1, I gave him freedom. I gave him as his wife. Anything about their life or anything that would be interesting?
So what did they do for a living?
Well, being very, very wealthy, they had a lot of agricultural fields. I also, Mrs. Bouvet, raised a lot of vegetables in the garden, and at times would sell the produce to people in the village. But mostly, the Bouvet family, when they came across the river, were the wealthiest people here. In 1792, Vital Bouvet built our home. It still stands today on Main Street. It's known as the Vital Bouvet home. It's one of 5 post-in-the-ground homes that still exist in the United States. And 3 of them are here in St. Genevieve. And one of the other ones belonged to Vital's brother, Jean-Baptiste St. Genevieve. It's out on St. Mary's Road. Also very wealthy. We had 21 slaves in 1791 to help with the agriculture and raising those children and other things that we did.
So then once they came to America, they were farmers.
When they first came, they were in Canada and they migrated down this direction. They were farmers. They were looking for opportunities just like early colonies that the Americans had.
So them, what did they do to get their money before they came to the land?
Not all of them had money when they came. They came over here looking for land and land opportunity
Okay,
as
they
well.
were wealthy when they came.
When they got here, when they got to Kaskaskia, they earned all this wealth. They started
Okay.
developing all this wealth. When they crossed the river and got to closest families and neighbors to them were the Louis Dukes, who was also very wealthy, and John Baptiste Ballet, who lived across the street from the So, very wealthy families were living close together. Any other questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My name is Jean-Marie Pepin de la Chance. I was born in Quebec, Canada, in 1737. I was the third of 11 children. My great-great-grandfather came from Normandy, France, to Quebec in 1651. It seems that after Champlain settled Quebec, old King Louis XV of France deeded a lot of land in Canada to his relatives. And they needed somebody to come over here and clear that land. So they put out a call for some volunteers, and my ancestor, Antoine, was a volunteer. The deal was he was to work the land for the king for 3 years. He was to get his own land, which he did. And so he got his land, he cleared it, and he was only 16 when he came over. So after 3 years, he was just 19. And he cleared his land, he built a little cabin on there and went to farming, like they all did up there. And he was doing pretty good for himself. But he wasn't very happy because he was kind of lonesome. There was no women up there. He only was 21 years old, no, 19 years old. And he needed a mate. And there was a lot of Iroquois Indians up there, but they didn't make very good wives for these squatters on their land because they weren't very happy they were there anyway. They weren't supposed to do that. So the King of France, and he saw the plight, and he decided to put out another call for some volunteers, ladies as possible wives for these Frenchmen. And quite a few gals volunteered. And the first group arrived in Canada in 1659. And Antoine didn't waste too much time picking a mate because he picked out Marie Teste, and they were married, and within 2 months they were married. So I guess it was pretty compatible because they had 11 kids together. And so they went out on their little acres that they gave her. He was allowed 200 acres after he worked for Kingston. So he got 200 acres of land. And he was there pretty well there. He built a little cabin on there and he started farming. They went to work young in those days. And he had crop out and everything. They did really well for the first couple of years. But the Iroquois didn't like them on their land. They did everything to get rid of them. They tried to run over their crops, and they would threaten them and burn some of their stuff, steal from them. So after a couple of years, he moved out of the Isle of Orleans, right in the middle of the St. Lawrence River, right adjacent to Quebec City there. A couple of people had moved out there earlier, and the Iroquois didn't bother him out there. So he gave up all of his land there that he worked so hard for, his little cabin and everything. He and his wife moved out in the island there. And they were okay out there. The Iroquois didn't bother him out there. So he raised his family out there. And my father was old Antoine's grandson. And we lived at the village of St. John out in the island of Florida. And that's where he raised his big family. But like I say, I was one of 11 kids. So our house got to be pretty crowded after a while. So my sister, Christine, and I decided to come down here into the Illinois country. And so we had a couple of cousins who came down here earlier, and they sent back word how nice it was here. The weather was warmer, growing season was longer. So we decided to make the trip, my sister Christine. So we started out in the spring of 1765. And it was really quite a trip. We went down the St. Lawrence River. We Lake Ontario, to Lake Erie, to the headwaters of the Maumee River, the headwaters of the Wabash, down the Wabash to the Ohio, down the Ohio to Mississippi, that's Castle, and over St. Genevieve. So we arrived in St. Genevieve in the summer of 1765. So I met my cousins down there, I have cousins here, and I worked for them for a little while. We did but St. Louis was just getting started then also. So I made a few trips back and forth to St. Louis here. And my sister Christine, she met a fellow up there. She got married in St. Louis. She married Charles Bissett up there. And she stayed up there. And when I trips back to St. Genevieve, I met Catherine Lallman there, whom I courted and married in the old town.
You can roll the... Here, hold on till I come up with your photo again.
In 1779, I got married. Got married in the old town, the old first place. And we built a little cabin car over on the river like all the other country did. And we were doing pretty good over there. We had our first son was born in 1780. But I started to scratch out living farming, but I was not a farmer. I'm a stonemason by trade. And there wasn't any stone houses being built in St. Genevieve, but there was in St. Louis. So I tried to talk my wife into moving to St. Louis. And finally I talked to her and said, well, you either starve in St. Gen or make some money in St. Louis. So we finally got talked to her to go to St. Louis, which we did. And we had 5 more kids in St. Louis. So we're moving back to St. Gen in 1792. And we went back to St. Gen then. Well, we had heard about this town being washed away and up there. Along with our little cabin, we went into town. People had moved up there to where we are today. When we came back, the Spanish controlled the area then. So I was looking to get a Spanish land grant. It ran from the river all the way up the edge of the cemetery. As far west you want to go with it. So I built a 2-story log house and got 2 blocks down there. And I went back to farming again. I was more successful this time because I had 2 boys to help me, 2 sons. So we were pretty successful then. There were still stone houses built around St. Genevieve, so I had to just go farming again. So anyway, we did pretty well, and Catherine and I raised our family, and they all got married and got families of their own, and her and I grew old together. And we're up here.
Very nice, very nice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Felix St. Jim. We really don't know where he's buried at in the cemetery. The only record we have, we know that he was buried here, and he was buried beside his parents. This is the tombstone of his father and his mother. His mother was buried over here. This is his father's grave. We know that according to the Goodspeed Southeast Missouri County history, that his brother said that he was buried beside his father's parents. So we think that he's buried right here, but we don't know. There's no tombstone. And all it says in the records, in the cemetery records, is that he was buried on this date. But he was in Tennessee when his father died. He fought in the Battle of Fort Donelson. He was born on December 13th, 1830. He was married and had 3 children. But he never got to see his son. He was away when his son was born. He had a daughter. She was about 6 years old. So he went and fought at the Battle of Pittsburgh's Landing, Tennessee, which is what the Confederates called it. The Union Army called it the Battle of Shiloh, Tennessee, named it after a church in Shiloh, Tennessee. The 13th Missouri Regiment was assigned to General Sherman's group. He was wounded on April 6, 1862. He died of his wounds at the hospital in Savannah, Tennessee on April 8, 1862. And he was buried here on April 13, 1862. He was a lieutenant colonel. He was there was in the regiment, in the military regiment, there was a colonel, then the assistant commander was the lieutenant colonel. So he was the assistant commander. The 13th Missouri Infantry, shortly after his death, became known as the 22nd Ohio Infantry. He was a lawyer. before he went to serve in the Civil War. He was ran for Attorney General of Missouri, but lost the election. A local historian says the reason he thinks he changed his name from Saint Jim, which is a French-sounding name, to St. James because it was more of an English-sounding name, and figured maybe he would win more votes. And he still lost the election. But that's what he went by from then on, St. James. As far as we know his wife died in May of 1911, and she is buried over in Valley Springs Cemetery. So even in life they were separated, and then even in death, because they stopped burying here in the 1880s. His son died about November of 1863, so the only surviving family member was his daughter. This is pretty much a historic family. It was one of the first settlers in St. Genevieve. They were pretty well off. I don't know if you've all ever been to eat at the restaurant on Main Street called In San Jim Bouvet, but it's in the same thing. Do y'all have any questions?
This looks like a bayonet.
It is a bayonet. I'm glad you pointed it out. During the Civil War, the bayonet, this is one of the uses of the bayonet. What they would do was the soldiers would stick the bayonet in the ground like I've got it, put the candle in there, light it, and then they would read letters and write letters on, and that's what they used the bayonet. That was one. Good question. Anybody else have any questions? I'm just hoping my candle lasts 2 hours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you.
18 years old. I met my husband and married him. Eugene Jacques Guibord. He was from the Guibord family. I found the home, his family home was up on Merchant and First Street. And then we lived in St. John, and our first child was born. And then we moved to Old Mines in Washington County, and we had 11 more children. And then when the parents passed away, my husband and I came back, and we lived in St. John, and then our last child was born. And then in 1859, I passed away. And out of all of those 13 children, only 5 outlived me. That was the sad thing back then, is losing all those babies.
Did you die in that house up there?
Been so long I don't remember. I've been in this place for a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Go ahead.
Guten Abend, or good evening in your English language. I am Julianne Seibert Suture. My friends call me Juliana. I was born in 1821 in Wolfsburg, Germany. In 1843, January 30th, my husband, my daughter, and I came over here to New Orleans, and then we traveled the way up the Mississippi River to St. Genevieve. The reason we came to St. Genevieve was because most of our German family had already migrated to St. Genevieve. I married Lorenz at an early age of 18, Lorenz being my husband. We came here, and then I soon caught malaria because of the many diseases at that time. After that, I died of age 22. The day was May 14th, 1843. My daughter Sophia, she married John Friedman, and she had 11 children. After that, Lorenz, after I passed away, Lorenz remarried twice. He also had 11 more children as well. Thank you for your time.
Died in July of 1854 when the cholera epidemic passed through St. Genevieve, and a number of the city, in fact approximately half of the city succumbed to cholera and died. At the age of 30, she was considered well past her prime because the life expectancy of a woman in Missouri at that time was 39. At the age of 30, to still be a school teacher was quite a feat because school teachers could not marry. If you became married, your responsibilities were then to your husband and your family, you did not have time for work outside the home. So they believe she contracted cholera through the water. At that time, there was no water filtration of any kind. Most people got their water from a well that they hand dug. They went to the creek or they went to the river. The first symptom from cholera is that you become incredibly thirsty. And of course, if you're thirsty, you want more water. Water is where the cholera, most of the cholera germs were. So the more you drank, the weaker you became. Within 48 hours, most people who contracted cholera were dead. The first day you were thirsty, the second day you were lethargic, your voice was a whisper, and by the third day you were dead. It was a very rapid demise. Very contagious. Yes, yes. And they really didn't have the sanitation. So most people, if you sent your kids to the creek to get the water in the bucket for the day, the bucket full of water sat there, and everybody took the dipper out of the same bucket, and then you'd go back with the same bucket the next night. You know, they got a fresh bucket of water usually for every meal, but there was no way to sanitize that wooden bucket. There's a good number of them, yes. I don't know exactly how many, but they said almost half the city of St. Genevieve was killed with cholera between 1854 and 1856.
That's about 900 people, so about 450 if there was 900.
You're welcome.
River in 1787. My father had come down to Kaskaskia from Canada. In fact, his nickname was the Canadian. He was born in Guibord, which is a little town just outside of Quebec. He came down to Kaskaskia, married the daughter of an army captain who had died at Fort Detroit. Her name was Marie de Plassey, and my father and mother started having children. But when I was quite young, he took us down to Arkansas, to an area called Arkansas Post. It was one of the first towns ever founded in Arkansas. And he started trading with the Indians, especially out in southwestern Oklahoma. While I was growing up, he sent me down to New Orleans to go to school. And down there I learned several languages. I became a secretary to Governor Morales. And also helped translate the Louisiana Purchase from French to English. But in 1805, I came back here to St. Genevieve and started to settle down. I wanted to open a merchant shop. But one of the first things I did is I married the daughter of Vital St. Jem Beauvais, whose house is still here in town, just down the street on the corner of Main and Merchant. But her father was a typical Frenchman. He made me sign a prenuptial agreement as to what was going to happen if I died first or if Marie died first. And that document's still on file in the courthouse here, and it's written in French, and it's a wonderful insight into 19th century French culture here in St. Genevieve. Marie and I had 11 children. 3 of them died young, as a lot of the children did back then. But 8 of them grew to adulthood. 1 became a senator, Louis V. Bogie. His name was really Vital, but he was so respected Senator Louis F. Lynn that he took the name Louis V. Bogie to honor Senator Lynn. And he also served as Commissioner of Indian Affairs for a while, and ended up living in St. Louis. Marie, after my death, went up there and lived with him also, and after she died, they brought her back here, and she's resting for eternity right next to me.
Got it? Done? Go.
I'm Father James Maxwell. I want to thank you for coming this evening. I came over from Ireland, 1794, but I studied Spanish, spoke Spanish fluently, worked to help this community, help them get through with the Spaniards and the transition of the St. Genevieve area. Also, I was a big property owner, owned property up here on the hill, owned property south and west of here, considerable amount, which I had set aside for the Irish settlers to have and to own their own parcels within the state. It worked out very nicely. I was working on it. We built the academy over here while I was here. And I was a big fan of horses. I had some really nice horses that enjoyed riding. But in 1814, my horse tripped. I went over him and I was killed. And that's the last thing that I remember.
I'm Antoine, I guess you could say any man. I represent approximately 300 to 500 people out here that have no headstones, primarily various tribes like the Illini, Osage, Piankashaw, Shawnee, several tribes from one time or another were buried in here, along with some French Gaulois and some Métis from Canada. And that's really my story. It just representing everyone who wasn't recognized officially.
Good.
My name is Michel Emerald. I was born in 1750 in France, part of the Revolution. After the Revolution was over, they raided my house. So I came over to America, landed in Pennsylvania with 2 of my sons, sent for my other 2 sons and my wife to join me. We went to Kentucky where we had Benjamin. Benjamin was our youngest son, 22 years old when we arrived in SteGenTV, and he ended up marrying Pelagie Vitel, which was a mulatto slave of Vitel and Felicity Beauvais. They gave me 5 grandchildren that I adored until I died at the age of 84. But I still want to go back to France.
Oh, my name is Ursula Guibord. I was married to Jacques Guibord. My husband is a famed and renowned explorer who was sent here from the King of France to explore the Americas. Excuse me, I'm sorry. My husband toured the Americas through the southern tip, came up the coast, went up the coast of Mexico, and came up through the Mississippi River through New Orleans, and resided on the Louisiana Territory. He became the first lieutenant governor here on this territory, here in SteGenTV. I'm one of the Barbeaus. I was a very wealthy girl growing up, and from a very renowned and respected family. My father was quite impressed with my husband, and he proposed my hand in marriage to him, and he consented. I bore my husband 4 sons, 4 very fine sons. 2 became college educated, 1 died in his youth, and 1 became an explorer like his father. My eldest son married Vital St. Jem's daughter. Vital St. Jem, as you know, lived across the street from the Bolduc house. Just right down the street, to your right, on the left-hand side. My husband built our home in 1806. My home, of course, is just down the street, now known as the Guibord Valley home. My family lived there for 100 years. I lost one son in his youth. My son, the Explorer, is where we got all of this information. I hope you enjoy him very much, because we've enjoyed it, and everyone seems to enjoy the knowledge that I have shared with you, that, you know, I'm able to share with you. My son's ambition was to go back to Paris, France, like his beloved father had lived there, and what he learned from his father. His father loved Paris. He only went back once, unfortunately, though it was during the Reign of Terror. What he saw there was so horrible and so despicable, he never returned. But he told his children how much love he'd had for that city, and how much power it had, and how much respect he had what it used to stand for. My son never got back to Paris, but that was his goal. He did, however, visit Cincinnati, which at the time was called San City, and he visited Louisville, Kentucky, which he professed to be great cities of commerce and great river towns. At the time, there were both little villages of under 1,000 people. At one point, my son decided he was going to go off to the Californias. On his way out there, unfortunately, he passed away in Kansas. He's buried somewhere between Wichita and Kansas City. Thank you very much for coming, and please visit my home down the street.
Or John Ferdinand Rozier. Ferdinand is this one, his wife, and their youngest son, Honorable, he died young. He was 25, just from an illness. It wasn't in kind of an accident or anything. John Ferdinand Rozier was born in Nantes, France in 1777. And he was the son, the second son and the fifth child of 8 children in Nantes. And his father was Francis Claude Rozier, and his mother was Renée Angélique Colas. And they lived in the parish of Germain in Orléans, France. Well, in 1805, there was a great deal of unrest in France. This was the Napoleonic era, and it was almost a certainty that Ferdinand and his good friend, John James Audubon, would be conscripted into Napoleon's army. His father, Ferdinand's father, didn't want any part of this, nor did Captain Audubon. He was also a friend of his father, of Ferdinand's. So they formed an alliance, and they drew up a partnership for the boys. They wanted to get them out of there. And they did do that. A year later, in 1806, the boys, now remember they're in their 20s, this was exciting to them. They set sail for America, and after 45 days at sea, it was a rough trip. They landed in New York. They immediately went to see Benjamin Bakewell. Where are you from? Here? Wisconsin. Wisconsin, okay.
Yeah, I had relatives
The
with it
Bakewell
too, though.
family is still very prominent in St. Louis. He went to see Benjamin Bakewell to purchase supplies. And they were then to go to Benjamin Bakewell's property in Philadelphia. It was about 2 miles from Valley Forge. They did do that. They went on to, and the property is named Mill Grove. And I've seen pictures of the house. It was a mansion, absolutely gorgeous. Looked like a Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
It was brick, you know, beautiful, beautiful windows. And it was self-sustaining. They had everything they needed. They had, you know, the orchards and the gardens and a forge, plus the mine. Now that was the main reason the boys went there, because they were going to take over the mine, reported to be the first mine in that era, in that location. Across the road from Mill Grove was the William Bakewell family. Now they had 2 daughters, and the boys, of course, met the girls. Audubon ends up marrying Lucy Bakewell. But that, I digress. Let me go on.
Are we talking about the Audubon?
Yes, John.
Is it?
John
Okay,
James
all
Audubon,
right.
the artist. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So they decided that they would move on. The parents decided to sell the mine, and they kind of split because Ferdinand had subsidized part of it. Well, he subsidized the trip entirely, but he also bought some interest in the mine. So they, you know, it was all very friendly. So they divided that up. And then the boys went back to New York to get more supplies. It was then that Ferdinand found out that his father had passed away 2 years ago. And he was very upset about that. Well, they went back from New York and headed toward Louisville, Kentucky, thinking to set up a stop. Remember, perhaps I didn't mention this, that Ferdinand's father, Francois, had been a merchant all his life. So he kind of had, you know, some knowledge of the business. So Ferdinand and Audubon set up shop. Didn't do well at all. They decided to move on. They went to Henderson, Kentucky, and you know, they stayed there a couple of years, but it wasn't turning out to be what they really were looking for. And they had talked about moving west, much farther west, and they decided, okay, now's the time, we're going to go. Well, they didn't wait till good weather. They started out in freezing winter, and they filled their canoe with what they thought would be the best thing.
Right.
So, 3 things: whiskey, dry goods, gunpowder. They had it made. They knew that was going to sell out there. So their destination was St. Louis. They never made it to St. Louis. It was entirely too cold. They were just about frozen. When they got to St. Genevieve, they pushed their canoe up on the land and they went into town, and they were absolutely amazed. This was not a backwoods town. There were people there from France who were educated. They had arrived with their silver and their lovely furniture. So Ferdinand was absolutely delighted. He couldn't speak a word of English.
Oh.
So all these people were speaking French, and he was very happy about that. So they moved in. Audubon, it just wasn't his lifestyle.
Right.
So they split, and it was okay.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Oh no, you stand by her and I'll take your picture.
Was Father Maxwell, was Father Maxwell a Jesuit?
I believe
You're not saying that.
yeah. Quite a few Jesuits around at that time. Thank you.
Oh yeah, those Jesuits,
Okay,
they were
so
everywhere.
yeah. Well, they ran things.
I know.
They are known for that. All right, so he moves on. He goes back to his wife and family in Henderson, and I won't go on with his story because there are volumes of things to read about Audubon.
I was just just watching a biography on him.
Yeah, he was. I've seen some pictures. He was very handsome. Some of the pictures of when he's older, he doesn't look as attractive, but he was very handsome. Well, in the meantime, when Ferdinand gets back here, he happened to meet Constance Roy. It's spelled R-O-Y, and sometimes it's spelled R-O-I, as in, you know, and her family was from Prairie du Rocher. But she was living in St. Genevieve at the time with her aunt, who was her mother's sister, one of the Barbeau girls. There were 6 of them, and all 6 of them married influential men in the area. It was just amazing. Well, her uncle was Jean-Baptiste Valley.
Okay.
And so he was pretty well known. Well, I said she was a Barbeau. So she married somebody well known. And then they settled in. The following year, he built a house on Merchant Street. It was a very large dwelling too. It was self-sustaining. They had their own, you know, smithy and their own gardens and animals. And they did very well, and he did well in business. Well, they had 10 children, and so one half of the house that he built was for his business. In the meantime, they needed more room, so he built another house on the corner of Main and Washington, and he closed a shop over there. And that remained there for as long as he was in business. When the boys were grown, he turned the business over to his second son. The first one wasn't interested at all. Loaned him the money to buy it and told him, yeah, pay me back. It was tough.
Yeah.
He was.
I guess he was tough.
Yeah, he was very well respected by his friends. He was honest and truthful, very stalwart kind of person. A very good businessman. When he turned the business over to Francis, he continued to look over his real estate holdings. He had extensive real estate holdings throughout southeast Missouri. He passed away on New Year's Day, 1864, just as the Civil War was ending. The children, was 9 left. They were scattered all over, I guess, really, but a lot were here. His wife lived on for another 14 years, and she stayed in the house. She had 3 servants with her, and just led a very quiet life. They left the 9 children. She left the 9 children. And 110 grandchildren.
Oh my God.
I don't know how she ever remembered any of them. But you know, they had to be very healthy people.
Yeah, they must have been. Oh, stalwarty.
Yeah. Well, there's that many babies to survive.
Oh, right, exactly. Yeah, well, nutrition, you know.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Private and Company K, 47th Missouri Infantry. And, right. He was in the 13th Missouri Infantry. I was in the 47th. Okay. And I joined the 47th in September 1864, right before the Price Raid. You know what that is?
No.
The General Price Raid?
No.
General Sterling Price was coming up from Arkansas to raid Missouri. He was a former governor of Missouri, and also he was in the legislature. And of course Missouri was Union, and our governor that was elected in 1860 was pro-Confederate.
Really?
Okay, and he vacated his office shortly after the war, and Missouri appointed delegates to a convention, appointed a Unionist governor. So
to replace the guy that left.
Right, and we also replaced the lieutenant governor. His name was Reynolds, Thomas Reynolds, and also the Secretary of State. We replaced him with Union appointed people.
Okay, but you went with this guy from Arkansas to...
Okay, so I was in the Union Army,
yeah.
And when I enlisted here, and I'll explain why that previous comment will be a little more important. I enlisted here in September '64 to meet the threatened raid by General Sterling Price, who was intent on reclaiming Missouri for the Confederacy.
I see.
Okay, and their initial plan was to a number of different options: take St. Louis or take Jefferson City, and put into place Thomas Reynolds, who was thought to be the legal holder of the governorship, because he was lieutenant governor when Claiborne Jackson, the originally elected governor,
well, what
put in
happened
office.
to you? I don't know these other people. You're right here.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that Sterling Price tried to take Missouri for the governor, for the Confederacy. Okay, and that's why Sterling Price was important. But his raid was here in Missouri, and instead of going to St. Louis or Jefferson City to take the capital, he decided to take out Pilot Knob for 3 different reasons.
That's just that away, isn't it? Or isn't Pilot Knob just out there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Out there. Yeah.
It's right. One of those mounds.
A little west of here.
Yeah.
Or northwest. So he was trying to take Pilot Knob mainly because of the Union stores that were there. That means ammunition, horses, cavalry, cannon, the whole, stuff. And he was going to take Pilot Knob in a day or so, and then go to St. Louis and knock out St. Louis, and then go to Jefferson City. The problem is that he couldn't take Pilot Knob, and so his plans all changed. But I was enlisted because of his raid, planned raid, and we knew he was coming, but we just didn't know much about it. But when I was mustered in at Pilot Knob in March of '64, I was sent back to SteGenTV to protect the town. So I wasn't in the Battle of Pilot Knob. So
you
that
got
other
mustered
stuff
in,
was
and then you
just-
got sent back here,
Yeah,
and so
right.
you missed it.
Right, fortunately I missed it.
Well, that probably was a good thing. Yes, yes,
So
yes. Actually,
I came
you lucked
back
out.
here,
Yeah.
and we served here protecting the town
Aha.
from Union guerrillas, marauders, and all the other trash that follows an army,
Right.
Union or Confederate,
Right.
to plunder and do
Right.
bad stuff.
There were
Okay.
those.
Yeah.
They were called. What did we just see? They were
Bummers.
called. Huh?
Bummers, or sometimes they
No.
call them.
No. The guys, the sort of outlaws that came after the war.
Guerrillas.
Remember we read about them?
Yes, I'm thinking.
Okay, so while you're
There's
thinking.
another thing. But
So
anyway,
we came back here, and
Yeah.
we stayed here until November,
Yeah.
and it was decided that we should be sent to Tennessee to meet a Confederate
Okay.
onslaught at Nashville. So we tried.
Nashville fell way early on. There
Yeah.
wasn't much Confederate left in
Yeah,
Nashville.
General
Because
Hood
it went down
from
in 2000.
Tennessee Confederacy. Yeah. Spring Hill,
Yeah,
Asheville.
yeah,
okay,
yeah. Bad
yeah.
battles in Spring Hill and Spring Hill, Rippavilla.
Yeah, this was in '64.
General killed there, big time. I mean, that was whoa.
Okay, but it didn't figure into me too much.
Because that was before.
I was
You
sent
missed it.
down there
Yeah.
in '64 to fight battles in that area. But by the time I got there, they were already over.
Done.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the only thing that happened to me when I was in Tennessee is that I caught consumption.
Ah.
And I was mustered out the next month in March of '65.
Before the war ended the following
Yeah.
month.
Ended the following month, and then I died of consumption in November 1866. Here in St. Genevieve, and was buried in a cemetery, but I don't have a stone.
So you came back from Tennessee with consumption to St. Genevieve, and they buried you here.
I died here the
You
next
died
year.
here.
Yeah.
The
In
next year.
September
Oh, you actually
66.
lingered on for a while.
Yeah.
Consumption took people out pretty quickly. You
Yeah.
must have been one tough critter.
Well, yeah, but not everybody died quickly.
Well, that's true.
Some people just got better. I didn't.
You didn't. So, how old were you when all
I
this
was 18 when I went into service.
You didn't last very. You died at 19.
And then I died
You made it that long.
a couple of years. This is a list of the men that served with me,
Aha!
mostly from St. Genevieve. These were all in Company K.
Wow.
And if when you go over that list later,
Uh-huh.
when you're home,
Yeah.
you'll see this EMM on here,
Yeah.
which
Mhm.
is a militia, Enrolled Missouri Militia.
I see.
Ah.
Yeah.
Who were organized to protect St. Genevieve before the war. They were only to stay here in
Oh.
the county.
To fend off the home
Yeah,
front,
right,
sort of the.
okay, yeah. And so
Yeah.
because of that, only 2 people on that entire list had any prior military service other than the militia. One guy was in a cavalry regiment, another guy was in an Arkansas infantry regiment. So we were basically just helpless people. We had no real training.
Well, most people
we had
didn't.
no
They were
marching
just sort of
training,
got
or, you know.
Shanghaied
So
into whatever.
go there, come here, you
Yeah,
know, whatever.
right.
And
Straggle along.
so fortunately, we weren't in any battles because I don't think we would have been a whole lot of good. But a lot of us died. About 10% of our company died from disease.
Well, lots of people did.
Measles
I mean,
was
Civil
a
War
big
was.
problem. And,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Diarrhea, things
Oh
like
yeah.
that.
Yeah. Water was not great.
I have a memorial
Well, and both
card.
of you guys actually had bad things happen to you in Tennessee. You may have not
It's a bad war.
Yes, it was.
This
It
is
was
a
terrible.
memorial card on me. I'd like for you to keep.
Thank
Give it
you.
to somebody if you don't need it. Gives a little information
My
about
partner does Civil War reenactments in Tennessee.
Yeah,
And she's got all the garb and, you know, I mean, it's really quite, it's quite impressive. So,
yeah. So you already
Thank
know
you.
a little bit about the war.
Oh,
you should learn a little bit more
heavens,
about the
if
Civil
you-
War in Missouri.
Well, I'm, you know,
Next time. Hope I
I have been to Shiloh more times than I can
Yeah.
count because my grandmother lived really close by, so I know a lot about the Civil War just from another perspective.
The lieutenant had the same problem. No prior military knowledge. His commanding officer said that he was the worst officer he had ever seen in his life.
He didn't
could
tell
not
us that.
drill.
He did not
And I'm
tell
sure
us that,
that
but
the
you're
first
adding
shot
on, aren't you?
that was
Yeah.
fired at Shiloh, he got one.
Well, it was a very bad battle. I mean, people were dying like flies there, and it was really, really tragic. I mean, that site is really something if you've never been there. It is truly. Well, we better move on and see some spirits.
All right.
Thank you so much for sharing
All
with
right.
us. Bye.
And I'm the only one in the cemetery who's buried right by my house, which is right there, the little green house by the entrance to the cemetery. And you'll note my grave is aimed right at the house. And that's because in 1811 the cemetery was still kind of new and there's a lot of land, so you kind of get a choice spot. So I got kind of a real nice spot here. I was the town doctor, and I had a brother who was the town gambler, which is a strange combo. And the gambler was gambling with a guy, and the guy claimed he cheated at cards, which was a pretty common claim. But in 1811, you would go to court with that claim. So he filed a lawsuit and went to court and lost in court, paid the fine, but he became obsessed with killing the guy's attorney named Crittenden. That was he was obsessed with, he had to kill Crittenden for some reason. The guy had offended him in court. So back then the only legal way to kill him was to have a duel. That's the only way you could shoot him and remain. So he filed for a duel with Crittenden. Well, Crittenden didn't see that coming at all, and Crittenden didn't even own a gun and didn't know what to do. So he thought and thought over the weekend of how to get out of the duel. So he came up with this weird legal argument for 1811 that since the guy had lost in court, he was not a gentleman, and duels had to be between two gentlemen. So therefore, he could not fight him. It would be murder. So he wouldn't show. He refused to show up. He refused to do the duel, but it wasn't like he looked like he was too chicken. So,
Very good.
yeah, so what happened was the gambler guy came over to my little greenhouse here and convinced me to act as his stand-in in the duel. And in the interim, he would teach me how to do dueling. So they had the duel set for October 1st, 1811 between the town doctor and the town lawyer, neither of which owned a gun and had any idea what they were doing. Well, at any rate, the gambler turned out to be a pretty lousy teacher because the attorney won, and I was killed and buried here, October 1st, 1811. But the weird ending was the town then had no doctor for 2 years. So the town got so upset over the fact that the doctor, who was not involved in this killing at all, had no involvement whatsoever, was killed, that they decided maybe dueling really isn't practical anymore. So they started a grassroots movement against dueling. There was only one more duel in Missouri after that, and they banned it. So, at any rate, that's the only positive of the whole dueling experience. And that's my story, the Walter Fenwick story, right there. Any questions? And I'm buried here with all these colorful characters. I got bagpipers and Union Army officers and all kinds of strange stuff in here. So it's a eclectic mix here in the cemetery.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you.
You bet, absolutely.